Cap Times Idea Fest 2020 is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors. Presenting sponsor, the Burrish Group at UBS, a financial services firm with global access and a local focus to pursue what matters most for its clients. Major sponsors are HealthX Ventures, backing entrepreneurs who are creating value with digital health solutions. Exact Sciences, pursuing earlier detections and life-changing answers in the fight against cancer. Quartz, health plans built with you in mind. And Madison Gas and Electric, your community energy company whose goal is net zero carbon electricity by 2050. Co-sponsors are Epic Systems and the Godfrey Kahn Law Firm. Other sponsors are Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, Home Savings Bank, Unity Point Health Meritor, Cargo Coffee, and the Forward Theater Company. Media partners are the Wisconsin State Journal and Madison.com, WKOW Channel 27, and Hinckley Productions. Please consider becoming a Cap Times member. Learn more at membership.captimes.com.
Hi, I'm Katie Dean, Executive Editor of the Cap Times, and I'd like to welcome you to this year's Cap Times Idea Fest. This is our 4th annual event, but the first time we're presenting the festival virtually. Our theme this year is 2020 Changes Everything. With the COVID-19 pandemic, its effect on the health, education, and economic well-being of our community, as well as the calls for change from the Black Lives Matter movement, there's a lot to talk about. This year's lineup is our best yet. We believe Idea Fest has grown into a signature event on the Madison calendar. It is also an important showcase for the Cap Times, our locally owned and century-old news publication. If you're not already, we hope you'll consider becoming a Cap Times member. As a member, you'll have access to special Idea Fest programs, plus benefits throughout the year. You'll also be supporting an independent and trustworthy local media source at a critical time. Find the details online at membership.captimes.com. I'd like to thank the Burrish Group at UBS, which is the presenting sponsor of Idea Fest and has been with us since the start, as well as our numerous other sponsors. So please enjoy this session of Idea Fest. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you all for tuning in and welcome to our panel discussion, where we'll walk through what to expect on and in the lead up to Election Day. Wisconsin is poised to yet again be a key battleground state this cycle in an election year shaped by the ongoing COVID-19 crisis and a national reckoning over racism. Both President Donald Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden have visited the state multiple times in the lead up to the November 3rd contest, as they seek to turn out supporters and court potential voters. Down ballot races are also on the mind. While the presidential race is the only statewide one on voters' ballots this year, Democrats have championed their legislative push to, quote, save the veto of Governor Tony Evers, as Republicans look to secure 3 more seats in both the state assembly and Senate to override Evers' legislative vetoes. Joining us today to discuss everything that's happening and could happen just next month are Marquette University Law School poll director Charles Franklin, Democratic consultant and Biden campaign senior advisor Tanya Bjork, and Republican operative Keith Gilkes of Platform Communications. Thank you all for being part of Idea Fest this year. I want to start by handing the floor over to Charles to give us an overview of where the presidential race is at, what the top issues are, and what your most recent polling data shows. Charles, take it away.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for having me and all of us back at Ideas Fest, even in this format. I want to hit a couple of quick things. One is, in the state, in my polling, Biden has held a small but pretty steady lead. We've done 11 statewide polls since August of 2019. President Trump led in one of those in November, and we had a tie in February. But otherwise, Biden has led by at least a point in all of them, and his average over that entire time is a 4-point lead. If we look at just recent polling, in May with likely voters, Biden led by 4, in June by 6, in early August by 5, and in early September by 4. We are in the field with a new survey that'll be out October 7th, so there will be an update for that at some point. We'll see whether it's moved again. But all in all, if you say small, medium single digits, 4, 5, maybe 6, that's the range we've been in. There's another set of polling. UW-Madison has a poll at 4 points, I believe. ABC and the New York Times Siena poll also are in those 4, 5, 6 range. Though there are several polls that have come out recently that have higher percentages, with Biden leading by 8 to 10 points. So there's a little bit of bifurcation in the polling. One cluster down at the low end where I am, 4 to 6, another cluster that's higher in the high single digits. Because we've seen so much stability, it's a question of, well, what could move this race? And that's a great question. We have about half as many undecided voters this year as we did 4 years ago. Only about 6% undecided, with another 4% saying they'll vote for the Libertarian. I consider all 10% of those undecided or up for grabs at least. But we were close to 20% at this time 4 years ago. Also, only about 8% disliked both Biden and Trump, but in 2016, 22% disliked both candidates. And so that's another source of uncertainty that's a lot lower this year than it was 4 years ago. And finally, of course, Donald Trump has been president for 3.5 years. So whatever uncertainty there was about how someone who had never held elective office would perform as president, that uncertainty is gone. Love him or hate him, we pretty much know who he is and how he behaves as president. Last thing is the 3 big Midwest swing states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, still remain terribly important. But there are other states that now seem to be battlegrounds, including Arizona, Florida, North Carolina, and as a bit more of a stretch, maybe Georgia, maybe Iowa. But that means there are more paths to a Biden electoral college majority. What's a challenge for President Trump is there are very few states that he lost in 2016 that at the moment the polling shows him winning. And so he does have a uphill battle there. He has mentioned Nevada, Minnesota, and New Hampshire among those, but recent polling in those states has not been especially favorable to him. So that's where we stand from the polling point of view and the Electoral College.
Thank you so much, Charles. Tanya Keith, do you agree with that assessment? Where do you see us at here in Wisconsin at this point in the race? Tanya, do you want to start?
Sure. Well, I obviously agree with Charles' assessment because it has my candidate on my side doing a little bit better. But it actually does feel, that's how it feels to us and to me, sort of as we view this election. It does feel like there's fewer undecideds, as Charles mentioned. It does feel like we're, the Biden candidacy is doing a fair bit better than the Clinton candidacy did. And there's also some other, things that are very different, which is, as you'll remember, in 2016, the Clinton campaign didn't spend as much time here or money here, and that's not the case this time. So I feel like Charles' assessment is pretty right on with what we're seeing and feeling, and also feel pretty good about it too.
What about you, Keith?
What I would take away from, especially from Charles' polling, is there's a trend line that Trump's been closing the gap over the course of the summer and into the fall. I'll be interested to see what his next poll shows, but I think that's also an element that we've been feeling on the Republican side, is that the president's been doing better. He's been on point on a number of messages. The more we talk about the economy, the better he does. And I think also the other element that's new that we'll probably eventually talk about sometime during this session is the vacancy in the Supreme Court, which is motivating probably for both bases, but has really excited the Republican base for an opportunity for President Trump to nominate Justice, or hopefully future Justice Barrett. So I think we all can feel different things. The thing I always remind people about polling is it is a snapshot in time. We still have a full month plus to go here yet on the election, and a lot can change, as we just recently saw in the course of that 30 plus days until Election Day.
Yeah, and I'm excited to talk to you all about the Supreme Court vacancy too. But before we get to that, I do want to make note of the fact that, President Trump is a very polarizing figure. And I wonder what effect that has on voter turnout efforts. Do you all think that helps or hurts turnout? Is his candidacy enough of a motivating factor on its own to draw out voters across the political spectrum? Charles, let's start with you. What are you seeing as motivating people this election cycle?
I think that it actually does motivate both sides. The Trump base is very devoted to him. Uh, the question is, how large is it? Is it in the 30% range or the 40% range? But that base is very devoted to him, very likely to turn out. But it also motivates Democrats. One of the findings that we've seen consistently is Trump voters say that they are more enthusiastic about voting for him than Biden voters do about voting for Biden. But Biden voters are just as likely to say they're absolutely certain to vote as Trump voters. And a vote cast is a vote cast with or without that enthusiasm or absolute devotion to the candidate. So I do think that turnout remains a question. The Trump campaign has targeted low likelihood voters, people who are positive to the president, but generally have not been very likely to vote. But that's a tough road to hoe, and we'll see whether it holds up. So I think we're looking to a high turnout election. Of course, the complications of coronavirus and absentee voting and in-person voting and early in-person voting all complicate the scene, and we'll just have to wait till November to find out what that final tally looks like.
Tanya, I want to jump to you next. Do you feel like there are issues on the ballot this cycle, or is it all about support of or dislike of President Trump?
No, I think, well, first to reiterate some of what Charles just said in terms of turnout, I think we are seeing a highly motivated electorate in both bases. And I think that's bearing out with the large number of absentee ballots or the vote by mail ballots that have been requested. It's a lot, and it's more than we've ever seen and more than I ever thought I would see, honestly. So I think that sort of shows that both bases are pretty motivated. I tend to think that our base is a little more motivated because of Donald Trump and because of the Supreme Court vacancy. I think that has motivated our base just as much, if not more, as it has the Republican base. So, but I also think that there are some pretty big issues that fall in the favor of Democrats this election cycle that sort of are on the ballot, healthcare being one of them. I mean, COVID is an issue that I don't think we have ever seen and probably will never see again, an issue that touches every single person in every single aspect of their life. There isn't anything you can do today that isn't impacted by COVID. And there isn't any one person that isn't impacted by COVID. So that is a very big deal. And I think that voters, particularly in Wisconsin, realize that it didn't have to be this way. Cases are getting worse and not better. And I think that's going to be a really big issue. And also closely tied to that is healthcare. Part of the reason that the Supreme Court battle is at such a fever pitch right now is because the oral arguments for the Affordable Care Act start on November 10th, right after the election. And so the Affordable Care Act and the protections that it provides for people with pre-existing conditions has been a huge motivating factor for Democrats and will continue to be so. So for all of those reasons, I feel like we're in a pretty good place turnout-wise and motivation and enthusiasm-wise.
Keith, what about you? You mentioned the economy, of course, before, but what are other big issues for Republican voters, and how does President Trump fit into all of that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there's a number of issues beyond the economy. The economy ultimately will always trump everything else, pardon the pun there, in terms of the issues. But the reality is there's a number of other elements that the president can champion. I think he pointed out in the debate and probably was lost in all the other headlines, but the fact that he's taken action on prescription drug costs, he has announced the pre-existing condition executive order. So there's a number of actions where I think he's got lots to talk about. The other element that I continue to reinforce to people that I think even the campaign itself is probably missing is the success that they've had in the Middle East in terms of recognition by other Arab states of Israel. I think that's a gigantic step forward for Mideast peace, and secondarily, in turn, would be a reduction in the number of troops that are deployed overseas, especially in hotspots like the Middle East. So there's some good things that could be championed out there. I hope that we get into more of those conversations in the next set of debates where we get into foreign policy and the successes that the administration has had. I think the hard part is, especially with the Supreme Court confirmation hearings coming up, a lot of that stuff is going to drown out the media coverage on other issues. So my expectation is we're going to spend a whole lot of time talking about the nomination of Barrett for the spot on the Supreme Court, and that we'll be talking a lot about economic activity, how the economy's doing, these flare-ups that are happening in multiple states, whether it's California, Texas, Florida. There's no state that's had a successful management of the COVID pandemic at the end of the day. And so there are challenges across the country. I think the president's putting a good foot forward and tackling the issue as best as he can with the information he has at his fingertips currently. But there's just the biggest issue that we don't know is what is going to be the next issue, and that could pop at any point, much like the Supreme Court nomination process that's forthcoming.
Yeah, thank you for getting into that. You mentioned the debate briefly, and I should note that we are recording this 2 days after the first presidential debate. I guess I would love to get your thoughts about it. I'm sure it's still top of mind for a lot of our viewers back at home, but I mean, who do you think won the debate, I suppose? And do you think the discussion swayed any undecided voters one way or the other? Charles, I don't know if you want to weigh in on this, otherwise I'll kick it to Tanya. But
well, debates rarely shift things a lot. People see what they want to see. I think, the early indications are that most of the polling shows people perceiving Biden doing better. But it's also true that I think a lot of Republicans in particular are saying both candidates did poorly. Not fully willing to embrace Trump, but not willing to give credit to Biden. Democratic voters, I think, are overwhelmingly seeing Biden as the top performer. I think the biggest danger, though, is that the first debate turned off voters who simply don't discriminate between the candidates, saw a very unappealing debate, and thus came away feeling worse about both of them. A thing to watch in the coming days, as both my poll and others come out, is does the favorability ratings of either Trump or Biden shift, as opposed to the direct question, who did better? Look for the consequential results, a shift in favorability, rather than just people declaring a winner or a loser.
thanks for that, Charles. Tanya, do you have any thoughts about the debate, how it played here in Wisconsin?
Yeah, I do. I don't think anybody's ever seen anything quite like that. And whether you think, Donald Trump did okay or not, I still think people were, even Trump supporters, I think were a little taken aback by sort of how that all played out. I have to believe that particularly independent voters, it may not have changed any minds of our hardcore base of our Democrats and their Republican bases, but I have to believe, and Charles polling will bear this out, I think. It'll be interesting to see, but I have to believe that independent voters, if they had to pick who they were more turned off by, for sure it was Donald Trump. I mean, the bluster and the whole thing. I can't imagine that independent voters who tell us that they want to be bringing the country together and trying to do something, trying to heal and solve some problems. I can't believe that they saw Donald Trump's performance and thought that was anything near what they were looking for.
What about you, Keith?
Yeah, I think probably nobody won coming out of this debate. And unfortunately, I don't think it's going to really persuade much of anything in terms of people's decisions. I think if you came into that debate for Trump, you left the debate being still for Trump, and likewise for Biden. The question would be, how many independent voters or people that were still undecided actually tuned in. That'd be the million-dollar question that everybody would like to know. And then ultimately, I always kind of bringing this back to the polarization question. Donald Trump's been polarizing since the day he came down that escalator and announced he was running for president. I think everyone knows, as Charles has pointed out, exactly who he is, how he conducts himself. I've made this reference before, which is he's a classic New Yorker, in my opinion. He's got a brash attitude and a brash approach to politics. And, in the famous words of Corey Lewandowski, who is Trump's first campaign manager, let Trump be Trump. And that is exactly what you got in that debate. And you're probably going to get that in the next two debates. And they can change all the rules they want, but he doesn't feel beholden to anything. And he's going to do it his way. And that's kind of the brand, if you will, that people knew they were voting for in 2016. And they may agree or disagree on how he's conducted himself along the way, but they knew what they were getting. They see it on display every day, and people voted for him. And my presumption is this is going to be a very tight race in a number of these states, including Wisconsin. And the win margins are going to be less than 50,000, maybe less than 20,000 for either candidate potentially.
Yeah, thank you for getting into that. I am excited to talk more about predictions and margins in the next segment. But first, I want to turn back to Wisconsin now and sort of reflect on the 2016 cycle. 4 years ago, we saw a bit of a reverse coattail effect in a way when Republicans turned out to support U.S. Senator Ron Johnson and not necessarily back President Trump. After 4 years in office, I'm wondering, I want to go to Keith first on this and then jump back to Charles and Tanya. But Keith, do you think President Trump is able to stand on his own with those voters after his time in the president's office?
Absolutely. I mean, he's got a track record. He's the incumbent. There's no movement, positive or negatively, on him. It'll all be within the margin for the polling. I mean, he's a known quantity. He was known to a great degree before he ran for president, and is known, to probably 99.9% of the voters by this point. So I don't think there's much that's going to change. I think he can stand on his own. A lot of this work that his campaign is doing is focused on maximizing every nook and cranny of the Republican base and finding every voter and turning them out that supports Trump. And ultimately, when you look at election day versus what the polls say, you're going to find out whether Biden is a true motivator of his base and any of those other low information voters at the same time that may support him versus, Trump and his base. And in 2016, he was successful on that. It's a different strategy. It's not one that we had seen before 2016, but we've seen, and, it's a way to win. I'm not saying it'll be successful again, but I'm saying it is demonstrated for President Trump and his approach to campaigning to be successful. He is doubling down on that strategy once again, and it is a very rare circumstance when a sitting incumbent president loses. And there's only been a few times in modern history here that has happened. So he's betting probably on the averages, and knowing that he's operated a few casinos, he probably knows the odds too.
Thanks for that assessment. Charles, can I jump to you real quick? Obviously, the president's race is the only statewide one on voters' ballots this cycle. This happens, once every 12 years? I mean, does that matter really in terms of not having a U.S. Senate race to also drive turnout?
I think it does a little bit. Senator Johnson ran more strongly across the state than President Trump did in 2016. And Johnson closed a very competitive race with Russ Feingold to win that. So I think there is an argument that among Republicans in the state who were hesitant about supporting Donald Trump, not President Trump at the time, that may have brought them to the polls for Senator Johnson. And along with that, they voted for Trump. We did see Trump lose the primary, for example, here, and struggle a bit with Republican leaders in the state during the fall, as well as media folks. So I do think there's some element to that. This time, it's entirely the presidential race driving turnout. With all due respect to the legislative races around the state, I think the presidency is the motivator here. And that puts Donald Trump, now President Trump, on his own. He won the race in the state with just over 47%, 47.2% of the popular vote. And Clinton lost the race with 46.5% of the popular vote. And we had about 5%, 6% go to third parties. So I think the open question is, how does President Trump go from that 47.2 to something very close to 50%, depending on how big the third party vote is? And flip that, how does Joe Biden go from 46 point something to also that close to 50% to be ahead of Trump? We really are, as we mentioned earlier, looking at what I would expect to be a close race. And how do either of these candidates move their margins up or down when voters are as polarized as they are?
Tanya, do you want to jump in there? Either weigh in on anything that we just talked about, or the question of how do you move the margins in such a polarizing national environment?
Well, first of all, I think Joe Biden and the Biden campaign have already moved the margins to some extent. I mean, they're treating, again, I mentioned this before, but the campaigns are treating 2016, the Clinton campaign and the Biden campaign are treating these elections very differently. And it couldn't be more stark. The other thing I would just say is that, COVID has changed everything. It is not only changed, it has changed voter attitudes. It has changed. It is there again. I'll say it one more time. There is no other issue that I've ever seen, nor will we probably ever see, that touches so many people in so many profound ways as COVID. And I do think that's going to be a huge factor in this race. And you there's a clear difference. You have one candidate who sort of believes in science and listens to experts, and another candidate who's here, even in our own state, having what we call, super spreader rallies all over the place, even in some places that have some very, very high case counts. And it is very dangerous. So I think for all of those reasons, I think the Biden campaign is in a much better place than the Clinton campaign sort of ever was, polling wise. And the other thing I would say is that because the world is so different now because of COVID and other things, I really think that this time people are really, Keith mentioned that this is the brand that Donald Trump has won on before, but I think people have really tired of that brand. I do not think that it is particularly what independent voters who decide these elections many times, I do not think it is what they're looking for.
I want to get back to that question of, what has changed since 2016 for both parties? And I think I'll head back to Keith for this one. What has changed since 2016 for Republicans? Obviously, we talked about how, President Trump can sort of stand on his own. He has a 4-year record of being in office, but has anything else, changed to sort of activate more voters or convince more people to turn out?
I don't know that anything dramatic has changed. I do think in the course of, President Trump's term up until the COVID pandemic, I think you saw a resurgence of economic activity that we have not seen in a very long time, since maybe the 80s and 90s. And people, I think, were grateful for that, gave and still continue to give the president high marks on management of the economy. And I think there is an element that was missing in the Republican Party over years of stagnation, et cetera, for a variety of reasons between the 2000s up until Trump assumed the presidency and championed some of the tax cuts and unleashing of the American economy, if you will, and challenging the superiority of other countries like China and Russia and others who were attempting to, be a counterbalance to the U.S. economic activity, et cetera. So I think that is something that's really changed dramatically. I think it still has a lasting impact with people knowing and seeing how well the economy was running all the way through, the early part of this year as well. And they saw it in their 401ks, they saw it in their paychecks, they saw it in the unemployment rate. There was a lot of success being achieved here economically. And I think, one, we're all concerned about our health, and that's got to take precedence first and foremost. And we're working through that and working toward a vaccine as quickly as humanly possible and safely. But at the same time, it's, once that's achieved, everyone's kind of turning their eye toward how do we get ourselves back on track economically. And I think really that's an element that is in the back of voters' minds as they head to the polls. Is we know eventually we're going to solve the COVID issue. It's going to take some tough months and some good hygiene and wearing masks and washing your hands. But at the same time, it's like when we're ready and we see the vaccine coming online, what's that next step to get the economy and get people back to work as quickly as humanly possible? And I think that's where Trump has a compelling case and an argument to, talk to people about, and especially in the first 3 years of his 4-year term.
Thanks for getting into that. Charles, is there anything else you want to add for context here?
Yeah, I'll follow up on that because I think that we can look at the president's job approval numbers across several issues, including the 3 crises that face us at the moment, and get a little context for this that in part goes along with what Keith is saying. First of all, the president's overall job approval is 44 approve, 54 disapprove. But his strongest area remains the economy, where he's at 52% approval in our September poll. That has been his strongest suit all along and was as high as 55, 56 earlier in the year before the coronavirus hit. So it has come down, but it's also come back up a little bit in the last couple of months. I think the critical thing here is in our polling, substantially more people say the economy is worse off now than it was a year ago. That's the normal problem for an incumbent president. But an even larger plurality think the economy will be better a year from now. And that's the potential strength for Trump to play to the high ratings he gets on the economy and the optimism about the future. We've heard not as much of that from the Trump campaign and from the president himself, but it is an area of strength. Handling coronavirus has come down from the beginning. He was at 51% approval in March, but is down to just 41% approval now on handling the virus outbreak. And his weak suit is actually how he's handled the protests, where he's at 36% approval now, up a little bit from 30% in June, but still his weakest area, and that holds nationally across all 3 of these issues as well in that order. I did a statistical analysis that includes partisanship and overall job approval, and of course, those are the 2 strongest predictors of the vote. But the next strongest is how he's handled the coronavirus. And his handling of the economy and the protests only have about half as much of an impact as handling the coronavirus. Since I think we're pretty sure the coronavirus won't just go away between now and Election Day, I think that's an important issue that's likely to continue to push voters at the margin. As I say, overall performance and partisanship are by far the strongest drivers, but there is a next place role for the coronavirus. And the economy and the protests, a strong suit and a weak suit, are both only about as half as important.
Sounds great. Tanya, I want to give you the last word before we take a brief break. Is there anything you want to touch on with that?
Yeah, I would just say that I think, when we're talking about the economy, and I think the economy is so very tied to COVID, I think right now. I mean, again, as I said before, there's no issue really that COVID doesn't touch. And with the disapproval of how he has handled this, I think really is going to undercut any sort of improvement that people see or think that they see in the economy. I think is going to be undercut by the mismanagement of the COVID issue.
Thanks for that. We'll discuss more when we come back. We'll talk about the open U.S. Supreme Court seat and how it could affect the election. Stay tuned for that.
Cap Times Idea Fest 2020 is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors. Presenting sponsor, the Burrish Group at UBS, a financial services firm with global access and a local focus to pursue what matters most for its clients. Major sponsors are HealthX Ventures, backing entrepreneurs who are creating value with digital health solutions. Exact Sciences, pursuing earlier detections and life-changing answers in the fight against cancer. Quartz, health plans built with you in mind. And Madison Gas and Electric, your community energy company whose goal is net zero carbon electricity by 2050. Co-sponsors are Epic Systems and the Godfrey Kahn Law Firm. Other sponsors are Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, Home Savings Bank, Unity Point Health Meritor, Cargo Coffee, and the Forward Theater Company. Media partners are the Wisconsin State Journal and Madison.com, WKOW Channel 27, and Hinckley Productions. Please consider becoming a Cap Times member. Learn more at membership.captimes.com.
Thanks everyone for sticking with us. Now we'll turn to a topic that has loomed large in 2016 and again in 2020, the U.S. Supreme Court. How does having an open court seat impact the dynamics of this election, and to what extent was it a motivating factor for Republican and Democratic voters in the past two election cycles? Charles, let's jump to you first. To what extent is this an issue that motivates voters?
Well, voters do say it's an important issue. As it happened, we had finished our second annual Marquette Law School national survey on the Supreme Court. So this was 3 days before Justice Ginsburg's death. So obviously things change after that. But we asked people, how important is the next nominee to the Supreme Court to you personally? 48% said it was very important. But among Biden voters, it was 59%, and among Trump voters, 51%. So a small edge there for Biden voters rather than Trump voters. Likewise, by party, 48% of Republicans, but 56% of Democrats said it was very important. And finally, when you look at issues coming before or may come before the court, of people who strongly favor overturning Roe versus Wade, 59% said the appointment was very important, but 56% of those who strongly oppose overturning Roe versus Wade, about the same. And finally, earlier, Tanya mentioned the Affordable Care Act, which will be argued before the court this fall. There, of those who most strongly want to strike down the Affordable Care Act, 53% said the appointment was very important. Of those who strongly oppose ending the Affordable Care Act, 61% said the next appointment was very important. Now, this goes opposite of the usual assumption that it's conservative groups that are more motivated by the court. That may in part be because of this being the third appointment to the court for President Trump. And so it's the opposition that's more rallied at this point. I will say, of course, since these were measured before the seat was open, it may be that the right is better at mobilizing its base beyond what its level was 3 weeks ago to become more motivated by it. But I do think that the easy assumption that there's an asymmetry that strongly favors conservative organizations and causes, that doesn't stand out in our data, at least not at this point.
And Tanya, do you see Democrats being fired up over this? And to what extent, how does that compare with past elections?
I do see Democrats being fired up by this. And I think what Charles said, it really just sort of validates that, because I also think it has a little bit something to do with the justice that we lost. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was very near and dear to a lot of particularly women's hearts. for all of the things that she did or to advance the causes of women. And so I think that it is a particularly motivating issue for women, not only because of the Roe versus Wade question that is very near and dear to many women's hearts, but also in healthcare, as Charles mentioned, and we mentioned before. It is literally going to be oral arguments start on November 10th, right after this election. And it's part of the reason why I think, the Trump folks and the Republicans are rushing so quickly to seat a justice before the election is because of that. And also because I think that they also hope to put a finger on the scale, or a thumb on the scale, as they say, on any potential election related challenges too. And so I think that also is a motivating thing. So it's healthcare, it's a woman's right to choose, and the ramifications of this upcoming election too all make it very motivating for Democrats.
Keith, I want to turn it over to you now, but I also want to pose the question to you. It looks like we'll get this vote. This vote will happen before November 3rd, but does it make a difference at all if the confirmation of President Trump's nominee would happen before or after the election? Do you think, conservative voters would be equally, riled up by that?
Yeah, I think the confirmation process and the hearings, what you saw during the Kavanaugh confirmation process was a viewpoint by the conservative movement of, I don't know what you want to call it, a character assassination, a struggle because of a conservative nominee getting through the confirmation process and how he was attacked. So there's some residuals within the conservative movement about, our type of nominees who adhere to a conservative ideology and philosophy as it relates to the judicial branch is we don't get a fair fight or a fair hearing. And I think that's a motivating factor in this, and will continue to motivate them as this plays out on TV during the confirmation process with Barrett moving forward. And that residual from that confirmation hearing is going to be motivation as you go into Election Day. Whether it was going to be the day before Election Day or the day after, it doesn't matter in terms of the final vote. It's the process that's going to drive conservatives, in my opinion. And part of what I have always hypothesized about some of the conservative voters that don't have a great track record of consistently voting is that they tend to be low information social conservative voters that really are maybe specific issue driven, pro-life, Second Amendment, et cetera, that are properly motivated when they see someone that aligns with their beliefs and they're willing to turn out. And I think that is what a lot of what the Trump strategy is built around. And I do think there is some truth to that, in that this process will motivate those type of low information conservative voters that are going to ultimately be part of Trump's base come Election Day.
Tanya, did you want to add anything about the impact of a timeline here?
Yeah, I also think we should not forget that the impact that this might have on individual Senate races too, right? I mean, we've got Collins in Maine, who I think for the first time in her career has really I think her challenger is already doing better than she is right now in some of the polling, or they're dead even. And I think people are not going to be pleased with in the state of Maine of pushing through this nomination, particularly given her history. We shouldn't also forget, Mark Kelly in Arizona, running against Martha McSally, and also Cory Gardner in Colorado. I mean, those are states that Joe Biden is doing pretty well in. And also, these are Republican senators that are going to have to take a vote that is really going to make, as I said, pro-choice women not happy.
Thanks all for that discussion. I want to turn, we just talked about obviously the implications on U.S. Senate races outside of Wisconsin, but I want to talk about other down ballot races in Wisconsin as well. How does the nationalization of this election impact, particularly congressional and state legislative seats? I wonder, in this environment, if there's an opportunity for more local candidates to personalize things and make their races not about the top of the ticket. Charles, do you have any thoughts on that and how candidates can do that?
Yeah, I think that what we've seen in recent years is that when you have a true national wave election, that can sweep across congressional districts. I'd point to 2006, which swept in Democrats and then added still more in 2008. But then that was reversed with the same districting in 2010 with a conservative wave that swept in the Republican majority. I think the lesson from those and the current districting, which certainly does favor Republicans, is you have to have a really substantial wave for that alone to carry you across the finish line. What we've seen in a few cases is recent Democratic successes in seats that are undergoing some kind of shift. The Milwaukee suburbs, for example, are giving somewhat smaller margins to Republican candidates. They're still voting majority Republican, but a little bit smaller. And that may make some of those seats more competitive. We did see one flip 2 years ago. But in general, I think the size of the national wave has to be really pretty extraordinary before it reaches down. Under our current districting, you need to see majorities for the winning, for the Democrats in this case, getting up into the high 50s before you really seriously threaten to overturn a lot of Republican seats.
Tanya, how do you see this playing out, the interaction between the down ballot races and the presidential race here in Wisconsin come November?
Well, I think it is probably more, they go together more than they normally do, even because of COVID. And this is the fourth time I've mentioned COVID, but I do think that has a really big impact because the mishandling of COVID from a federal level with the Trump administration also trickles down to the Republicans in our state legislative seats too, because these are Republicans who are right now actively, fighting a statewide mask mandate. And that is not where independent voters are. And it's really not where suburban women voters are. I mean, suburban women voters, which are in some of these seats that I think are now beginning to become into play. Like, listen, I'll be honest with you. Like if you were to tell me that there are 4 or 5 seats in the suburbs of Milwaukee and around the state that were really going to be in play because of, as Charles mentioned, because these seats are redistricted in a way that so heavily favors Republicans, I would have said no. As much as I would like that to be the case, I wouldn't have thought it was, but it is. And I think that COVID is really part of the reason, and healthcare is part of the reason for that. I mean, suburban moms are struggling with figuring out how to homeschool if that's what they're trying to do, or do virtual learning. And if they are sending their kids to an in-person learning situation, it's scary. It's just not a really good place. You add into the Supreme Court vacancy and rushing to fill it and filling it with somebody who is not going to be with them on choice and on healthcare. And I think we're going to see a few pickups that in the legislative branch here in Wisconsin that we didn't expect.
Keith, I want to get your thoughts too, but I also want to ask, sort of going off of Tanya's point, are there places in the state, the Milwaukee suburbs or others, where it might be harmful for Republican legislative candidates to have that association with President Trump?
Well, number one, what I'll say is no matter what, your base winning at a state legislative race level is working from your base over to the independents and the ticket splitters. And so I don't think that you need to necessarily be adverse to the president. I don't think you necessarily need to embrace him wholeheartedly in every aspect of, his personality and, his comments at the end of the day for these state legislative races in those candidates running in them. Ultimately, the success of the Republicans in this state controlling both the Assembly and Senate, and I was there in 2006 and 2008 running state legislative races in that national environment. And what I will say is I saw on the front end in 2006 losing the state Senate majority and being a part of that set of campaigns and seeing that national wave carry a number of really good, Republican senators out of office. At the same token, when we got to 2008, our candidates knew what potentially could happen at the top of the ticket and were preparing themselves. And how did they prepare themselves? By going door to door, knocking on doors, talking to people, getting into the communities, engaging them in dialogue and conversations, getting their message out on the key important issues. And I think the Republicans have that opportunity here in 2020 to do that as well and survive any type of national wave should there be one. And ultimately, I think their success, especially like in the Milwaukee suburbs, I lived through that 2008 when everyone was promising that Alberta Darling was going to lose her race, and she won it by a significant margin. And I saw Republican senators run, 15 points ahead on the ticket, against Obama, Obama-McCain in 2008. And so it's possible to succeed at a state legislative level. And the number one thing you got to remember is on a presidential election, there's a number of voters that go vote for president and then they stop filling out their ballot. So there's always a significant undervote. People don't feel confident in making picks or decisions at the state level. They don't know the candidates. So they decide they're going to vote for president, and that's as far as they're going to go on the ballot. And that plays into the benefits of what Republicans have been so successful in holding the majority of the vast amount of time over the last 3 decades in both the Assembly and Senate, less so in the Senate, but still the reality is they've been very successful even in difficult environments. And it's not always been because of redistricting, which is the boogeyman that the Democrats always want to push out there. It has been success because of a recipe of the type and quality of candidates, their willingness to go work their communities, and their willingness to convey the right message to the voters that they care, they understand, and they're working hard on those issues.
Great. As we're nearing the end of our time, I'm going to sort of switch us onto a totally different subject, which is, how the difference is, I suppose, in how voters are planning on participating in this election. There was a partisan breakdown in past polling that showed Republicans are more likely to show up in person and vote on election day, but with the uncertainties over the post office, there also seems to be a slightly maybe reduced enthusiasm for Democrats around absentee voting. How is that playing out among both parties? Tanya, do you mind if you start on this one?
Sure. So I think, the mail thing, I think we were worried about, especially when, the Trump administration was kind of screwing around with the mail and, the post office. But I will tell you that there are more absentee ballots, I think, back already today than there even were cast in 2016. So I think there are also a number of more ways to return those ballots too than just by mail. So, there are drop boxes and people will be returning them to clerk's offices as well. So it's not just the mail. There are a lot of other ways to do that. I also just think that before this sort of recent uptick in cases in Wisconsin, even Democrats were feeling a little bit more like that they would also be voting on election day or voting early in person. So I don't think we're certainly not going to give anything up to the Republicans. And I think, again, what we're seeing in the absentee ballot requests that are being made is some serious Democratic enthusiasm, and I expect that to carry on through the in-person early vote period, which begins October 20th, and on election day too.
Keith, I guess is the Republican messaging on this just sort of vote however you're able to? Is there a push towards in-person versus absentee voting, and what do you see? How do you see that playing out this election?
Well, from my initial take would be, especially because, look, we've already gone through this election process in the midst of COVID in April, in a special election in May in northwestern Wisconsin for a congressional seat, and then again in August for primary day for state legislative races. So, we've proven we can get through an election day. They don't become super spreader events. They're safe, it's secure, it's sanitized. I think the poll workers have done a wonderful job. The clerks have done a wonderful job, and kudos to them to making people feel safe and actually conducting elections in a safe and healthy manner. So for Republicans, I think they're focused on all the above. No matter what, you're still going to have a certain segment of the Republican Party and its base that are going to absentee vote. They did it before, they'll do it again, not just because of the circumstances of COVID, but because they're used to the practice, they're well informed of the process in terms of absentees. You got in-person early voting going to be happening 2 weeks in advance. I think all those situations are going to allow Republicans to vote. Yes, I think the predominant wisdom would be that the vast majority of Republicans are going to vote on Election Day, and I think they've seen and understood that they can do it safely and successfully. And I think there is, as we've seen in Wisconsin especially, there is pause to returning your absentee ballot via the U.S. Postal Service. While they're very good at delivering the mail for the most part, there are instances of mail being found in, ditches in Outagamie County, buckets of, absentee ballots that never got to their intended recipients in the service area of Winnebago, Oshkosh area. So, I mean, there's circumstances where things have not gone well with absentee ballots. So I think there's an element to this of people believing I show up on Election Day, I know my vote goes and gets counted because I put it in the machine myself. And I think within the Republican Party, there is an element of that is going to be on Election Day the most important thing for them to do.
Charles, have you seen a partisan breakdown in your polling when you ask about this?
Oh, yeah. The Democrats much more likely to say they'll vote absentee early. Republicans much more likely to say vote in person on Election Day. But this has been changing. Democrats have come down in the percent who say they'll vote using absentee. I think the irony here is that as President Trump has complained about absentee ballots and tried to frighten people about them, or at least argue that they are unreliable and fraudulent, he's on the one hand discouraged his own supporters, many of whom have voted absentee in the past, from being comfortable about that, but ironically has probably also lowered the Democratic voters' confidence in the ballots, or as Tanya mentioned, lack of confidence in the Postal Service. So I think we may, by Election Day, see fewer absentees among Democrats than I would have expected in, say, June. But I also think if you just look at the number of absentees that have not only been mailed out, but have been already returned, we will see a very high absentee vote count this time. I'm just not sure whether the partisan gap between them will end up being quite as large as we were expecting, as I say, in June, before worries about the postal system or disqualified ballots became an issue.
Yeah, I want to look ahead to, some post-election thoughts too. Obviously in Wisconsin at this point, with Judge Conley's ruling and assuming that stays in place, absentee ballots can be counted through November 9th, as long as they're postmarked by November 3rd and received by November 9th. But that has sort of, that's led to the thought that we won't really know an outcome, obviously, in the election, a final unofficial outcome in the election in certain key states and perhaps nationally. Adding to that, President Trump hasn't said whether he would accept the results of an election. To what extent are I guess these sort of outlying concerns about the reporting process and the transition of power valid at a national and state level? I'm not sure who wants to start off with this, but Charles, I might kick it to you first. It's sort of a tough question.
Yeah. I think that there are real issues, and we may see a very complex outcome. I do want to say it might not be as bad as some of the scenarios suggest. Here in Wisconsin, most places count the absentees at the voting place, at the ward level, rather than at a central facility. And that turns out to be a good thing because you distribute all of these absentee ballots across thousands of polling places. So you don't have a massive backlog. One of the major exceptions is the city of Milwaukee, which does do a centralized count and which sometimes has been slow to do that count. I think the takeaway would be we might not know at 10 or 11 on Tuesday night, election night, but I think we will have a nearly complete count by the wee hours, or let's say dawn, on Wednesday morning. Now, it won't be final. There will be a trickle of ballots. So if we're at a 23,000 vote margin the way we were in 2016, then it absolutely will be a prolonged counting process. In terms of the country as a whole, the good news is that some current battleground states, including Florida, have been doing most of their voting by absentee for years now. And they have that process down, and it's efficient, and they count massive numbers of absentees very quickly on election night. Ohio's another example of that. And so it's possible that we will see relatively definitive outcomes in some major states, which if they're close or, it won't necessarily clarify the election, but if they're not close, it will tell us a lot about where the Electoral College is going. There are some states to worry about. Pennsylvania, Michigan are examples there. But other states like New York, which has had a lot of trouble with absentee ballots, and California, which is famously slow, I don't think anybody thinks that those might tip over to President Trump's side. And so therefore, even if we don't have complete counts, we're still very confident about the Electoral College. So in close elections, this could be a big deal. But in individual states, we might have a better view of the Electoral College result sooner than a lot of the concerns about absentees would suggest.
Tanya, let me go to you next. Looking ahead to Election Day and beyond, do you have any concerns about the process, when results will be known, and what are you advising people to keep an eye out for?
Yeah, I don't have as much of a concern as you might think I would. I think the part of the reason that the postmarking issue for absentee ballots was a bigger deal in April is because of all the confusion at the end about requesting them and it was very, very uncertain and nobody really knew. And so people actually really did need that extra time to get it in. And the post office was a little bit not used to sort of COVID and all the different things that had to happen. So that extra time maybe was needed. It's not now. So although I'm not saying that we shouldn't allow it, I just don't think not a lot of people are going to be hanging on to their absentee ballot until election day and turning it in. I mean, it's just not, most people got their absentee ballots have had them already for 2 weeks, even now, and we're only on October 1st. So I really don't see a lot of people hanging on to their ballot and waiting. So we're not going to see a big glut of absentee ballots coming in after election day. I just don't think we're going to see that. The other thing I don't think we're going to see, which we did a little bit more in April, is clerks and election workers are much more prepared now than they ever have been. The poll worker recruitment, I just saw, the clerk in Madison said that she's got, 6,000 applications for poll workers and really only needs about 3,000. So she's got twice as many as she may need. And that's all to say that I just think clerks are much more prepared than they ever have been. And I think that will lead to a smoother count and a smoother election day. I hope. And I also, I hope that I really, really hope that there's no Republican shenanigans. We haven't seen that in Wisconsin for a while on election day. And I really hope we don't see it again this one either. But I really expect that election day and all the early voting in person that happens the 2 weeks before election day, starting on October 20th, I think it'll be smooth, safe, and secure, and all the votes will be counted, and we will know who has won the presidency. Might not be at 8:01, but it'll definitely be that night.
Thanks for that. Keith, do you want to jump in here? What are you looking out for as unofficial results are finalized in these key swing states?
Well, we always look for areas of agreement. Tanya and I agree on this point. I do think these elections are being conducted very well by the local clerks. They know their communities. They know how to get these ballots out to people. They encourage them to get it back. I encourage them to, anyone listening, watching this, please just fill out the ballot, make your decision, and send it in, and make sure it gets counted in an appropriate amount of time. But I agree with Charles and Tanya. My belief is we are going to know decisively who has won the presidency by Wednesday morning. It could be at 5 a.m., 6 a.m. It may take a few hours longer than it has in the past. But the reality is I just think these states have become very proficient. They've had opportunities with primaries in many of these states, so they have a system. They understand. Now, there are certain states that have some kinks to work out, and they could be hot spots in terms of election night and some back and forth, and in terms of the parties and wondering, why the results haven't been reported, et cetera. So we're going to have a lot of ruminations, if you will, all throughout the night. But I say that by Wednesday morning, we will have a decision. It'll be pretty straightforward, cut and dry, who the next president is going to be for the next 4 years. And I just believe in that. And, I, like Tanya, I'm going to be keeping an eye out for those Democratic shenanigans as well. So I'll make sure we hold that party accountable and make sure that they're not doing anything nefarious as well.
Well, we'll keep an eye on everyone, I guess, come election night. So that sounds good to me. I want to end quickly. I know we're reaching our time, but I want to wrap up with election predictions. I mean, last cycle, President Trump won Wisconsin by, a margin of 23,000 votes. This time around, I guess, I don't know if you want to make any predictions about which candidate will win. I think I can guess here. But how close will it be in Wisconsin? Charles, do you have any thoughts initially?
Well, I think the history of recent elections suggests the safe answer is to say it'll be close. 3 of our last 5 presidential elections were decided by less than 1%. And if I were advising either party, I would say, think it will be less than 1% on the margin and behave accordingly. More importantly, I would say to voters, remember that the polling, whether it's mine or anybody else's, does not determine the outcome. This election and the future of the next 4 years is in the hands of the voters. And that's where it belongs in a democratic republic. And I'm sure everyone else encourages people to get out and vote. As for predictions, remember, I had Clinton ahead by 6 in 2016. I'm going to say the same thing as I said then. My final poll is my best estimate of where the election will be. But I was wrong before. I've been right before. I hope you'll pay attention to it, but I hope you'll vote the way you want to vote, far more important than paying attention to what my prediction might be.
Tanya, do you agree? It'll be close in Wisconsin?
My prediction is it'll be close. It won't be as close as last time, and Joe Biden will be our president.
All right. Keith?
Well, I'll do a weatherman approach to this and say it's sunny, partly cloudy with a chance of rain. 50,000 plus or minus, somewhere in there is going to be the margin. And I agree with Charles, it'll be around less than that 1%. And it could go either way. And I think it's going to be a battle all the way until the polls close at 8 p.m. And it's all about who's going to get whose base out and what's the turnout in each of those respective bases. And we'll tally the votes and see where it ends up.
That's right. I hope we're all feeling empowered to vote now after that great discussion. Thanks to all for setting the scene for us. And thank you all for tuning in to this IdeaFest session. Check out captimesidfest.com for the rest of our schedule. Tune in next week, a personal plug here, for my one-on-one interview with Governor Tony Evers. It's on October 8th. In the meantime, get your absentee ballots back to your local clerk ASAP if you are voting that way, or make plans to vote in person, absentee, or at the polls on Election Day. Thank you again so much.
Cap Times IdeaFest 2020 is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors. Presenting sponsor, the Burrish Group at UBS, a financial services firm with global access and a local focus to pursue what matters most for its clients. Major sponsors are HealthX Ventures, backing entrepreneurs who are creating value with digital health solutions. Exact Sciences, pursuing earlier detections and life-changing answers in the fight against cancer. Quartz, health plans built with you in mind. and Madison Gas and Electric, your community energy company whose goal is net zero carbon electricity by 2050. Co-sponsors are Epic Systems and the Godfrey Kahn Law Firm. Other sponsors are Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, Home Savings Bank, Unity Point Health Meritor, Cargo Coffee, and the Forward Theater Company. Media partners are the Wisconsin State Journal and Madison.com, WKOW Channel 27, and Hinckley Productions. Please consider becoming a Cap Times member. Learn more at membership.captimes.com.